Hi, everyone. Welcome to another unscaled, off the map conversation. Forgot what I was even doing there. We are going to be talking with journalist and author Walter G. Meyer about one of the strangest presidential mysteries in American history, the sudden death of our 29th president, Warren G. Harding, who served from 1921 to 1923. Was it a stroke or a heart attack, or was it something more deliberate? Walt has visited some of the key sites and is going to help us untangle some of the facts, the folklore, and the century old rumor that Harding was actually murdered, possibly by his own wife. So, Walter G. Harding is an award winning filmmaker and novelist. He has written 8 books as well as hundreds of articles for newspaper, magazine, and the web. He's visited all 50 states, 38 national parks, and 20 countries, so he's very well traveled. He spent the summer of 2024 working in Denali National Park, where he first learned of the bizarre story of Warren Harding's possible murder by his wife. We're going to get into that. Walt recently also created the YouTube channel Walt's Wanderings to share some of his stories and photos. Walt, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us today.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think it's funny when you introduced me, you said Walter G. Harding. Yes, it's Warren G. Harding and Walter G. Meyer, but honest mistake.
I totally, you know what? You guys gotta, y'all gotta change up your names, man. Somebody's gotta change the name.
At least my middle name isn't Gamaliel.
Walter G. Meyer, Warren G. Harding, brothers from different mothers. They didn't do it. So, for people who give us a brief over, I mean, because you have Warren G. Harding, who is tied to things like the Teapot Dome scandal. What is like a fifth grade interpretation of what the Teapot Dome scandal was?
Just a little background here. Warren Harding didn't particularly like politics or want to be president. His buddies wanted to be president, and we later found out why, because they could take advantage of it. But and his wife wanted to be president, but he really didn't even campaign for president. He sat on his front porch in Marion, Ohio, and drank beer, this during Prohibition, while other people campaigned for him. And he played cards, and he caroused with women, and he was completely fine with all of that. But while he was president, he didn't exactly supervise his cabinet and other people who were working for him. He was having a good time with the ladies. There's at least one confirmed illegitimate child he had, but he had numerous mistresses. And his wife pretty much ran the day-to-day government things. She was fine with that. And his buddies did what they wanted. And his Secretary of the Interior, a man named Albert Fall, who we'll come back to later, decided to sell off the U.S. Navy's oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and pocket the money for himself.
So, like, he didn't want to be president. He ends up president anyway because America, that's
right.
what we do.
Yeah, he had no great interest in being president, but people said, and this is crazy, he looked presidential. A lot of people thought he looked presidential, and women had just gotten the vote, and so they were actually part of the campaign was, isn't he handsome? Doesn't he look presidential? Women, vote for Warren Harding. It's crazy. That was his campaign, was I look presidential.
But you've actually been to the Harding home and memorial in Marion, Ohio.
He wasn't home. I should have called first.
Yeah, you should have. I mean, knock at least in a carrier pigeon or something beforehand. But how do sites like this handle a legacy like that? Do they acknowledge the scandals, or do they kind of steer clear of what his presidency was actually kind of boiled down to?
Well, in fairness, I was there almost 40 years ago. Oh. And so things could have changed dramatically by now. But back then, there was no mention of whatever. It was a very superficial whatever. And about 40 years ago, I went to Wheatland, which is the home of President James Buchanan in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And Buchanan lived rather openly with his lover, Senator Rufus King of Alabama. They were so obviously a couple. They got invited to events together. Invitation list. Senator and Mrs. Smith, Senator and Mrs. Jones. Senator King and Senator Buchanan, and so much so that President Andrew Jackson, who hated them both, openly referred to them as Aunt Nancy and Miss Fancy. So you don't have to use a lot of imagination as to what was going on with these guys, right? Well, when I was at Wheatland, Buchanan's home, I asked about the portrait of Senator King, because for Buchanan's entire life, he carried a life-size portrait of Senator King with him wherever he went. When he was in the White House, King had died in the 1850s, before Buchanan became president. But for the rest of his life, he had a life-size portrait of King he carried everywhere. And so I said, where in the house is, if I had urinated on their entry hall rug, this woman could not have been more apoplectic of, we do not talk about Senator King in this house. And so it was like, oh, okay. But a friend of mine was there last year. And just brought this up the other night. He said they now have a rainbow flag at Wheatland, and they rather openly acknowledge that Buchanan was our first openly gay president, even though you couldn't be openly gay in the world. Word gay didn't even exist yet, but they acknowledge now Senator King, was his boyfriend. And there are historians, by the way, little side note here, who actually blame Buchanan. Buchanan's ranked as one of the worst presidents ever. And part of that, people blame that he let the U.S. slide into civil war because his then late boyfriend owned over 300 slaves. And so he didn't want to take a firm stand against slavery, either as a senator or when he became president, because he didn't really want to upset his boyfriend. So that could be part of it. And, so it tells a more complete picture of the history of Buchanan. And I could go on about, other presidents whose little side things were actually more important than you might think. So when I was at the Harding home, they didn't mention it. But as I said, history's become a lot more inclusive now. They mention things, when I was at Thomas Jefferson's home, there was hardly any mention of slavery. But now they've restored the slave quarters, and they talk about, how badly the slaves were treated there, which is part of the full portrait. The guy who wrote "All Men Are Created Equal," well, yeah, except my slaves. So I think they are probably, but I have not been to Marion, Ohio to know for sure. But there is a beautiful memorial to him there when he died, young and handsome in office. Like when you mentioned JFK, when you die young and handsome in office, you get sainthood, basically. And they built this beautiful memorial. It's almost on a scale with the Lincoln Memorial or Jefferson Memorial. And then all the dirt hit the fan, and nobody wanted to dedicate it. No other president wanted to go near this thing. So it's a weird tourist attraction in Marion, Ohio.
That's a lot to unpack. There's so much there. We can totally spin this off in a different conversation. But you know what? Let's press forward. Let's actually rewind a little bit to the summer of 1923. Harding is actually heading to Alaska. He's doing this trip. What was the purpose of this trip to Alaska? Why was it such a big deal for the new Alaska Railroad?
Alaska was finally getting a railroad. Mount McKinley National Park, as it was then called, it's had its name restored to Denali, which it had been for thousands of years. But for a while there, it was Mount McKinley, named after another president from Ohio who died young, William McKinley. And so Harry Karstens, who was the first superintendent of McKinley/Denali National Park, pushed for a railroad because there was almost no way to get there. I mean, to this day, there is really one major road that goes from Anchorage to Fairbanks, a couple little offshoots, but that's kind of it. And there's one rail line. You don't get around easily in Alaska to this day. So back in 1923, there was hardly any way to get around. And so they really wanted a rail line, and they thought it would kind of put Alaska on the map and the new national park, which had been founded in 1917, on the map if they had a railroad that you could easily get to the park. So they thought it would be a big deal if they could get Warren Harding, President of the United States, to come and drive the Golden Spike when the railroad was completed in Nenana, Alaska. There's one of the worst museums I've ever been to in my life is the Nenana Railroad Museum. It's like somebody's attic that hasn't been cleaned out in a while. But they have pictures of the ceremony, and Warren, when he wasn't drinking or whatever, he was a newspaper man. So not exactly a rugged outdoorsman, not exactly a skilled laborer. They said it took him 3 attempts with the sledgehammer to even hit the spike the first time. So the ceremony already was not going great, shall we say. But he did drive the Golden Spike in Nenana. Some workmen finished driving it the rest of the way in. They could declare the railroad open, and everybody was happy for the moment.
We mentioned this legend about his death, about Harding's death, and how it all came to be. The rumor kind of starts at McKinley Station. What's said to have happened there? Who exactly was this guy named Maurice Marino, who's kind of tied up in all of this, who was a roadhouse owner, and kind of tied to the poisoning story or the angle there?
McKinley Station was a town in what is now Denali National Park. It had been absorbed into the park. The town was there first. It was a stopover for gold miners. The Alaska Gold Rush was a big deal. And there's a great line in Casablanca where Sidney Greenstreet declares himself in charge of all the illegal operations in Casablanca. Well, that was kind of Maurice Moreno. He was in charge of the gambling, the women, the booze. This is prohibition, but he had no problem serving alcohol. You could make juniper berry gin fairly easily. He sent hunters out to kill game in the national park, which is, of course, illegal, but then he could promise you a Dall sheep steak for dinner, caribou steak for dinner. And he ran some gambling, and he had some women there because the miners got lonely. So he was in charge of all the illegal operations there. In fairness, Maurice was a good guy. He also kept that down in the hole, as they called it. There was a little, valley there. So it was out of sight of the children. And he built the school. He built the post office. He built, he was a civic-minded person, but he also saw an opportunity and should be doing whatever. But the point to all this being, he was not above illegal activity. So I'm not accusing Maurice straight out of murder because we don't know, can't know, but clearly. And Harry Carsons, who I mentioned earlier, the first superintendent of the park, he locked heads with Moreno all the time because Harry was the law in the area, and he would try to break up the illegal still and try to break up the other things that were going on. And Maurice was like, whatever. And Maurice was an Italian immigrant who would stand on the front porch of his roadhouse and sing opera as the train pulled into the station. So as you got off the train, the first thing you heard was a really bad opera singer. And Harry would try to entice people to come over to the park, and Maurice would be like, I've got women, I've got booze. And so a lot of people, went that way. And so he had arrested Maurice several times on various charges, but they never seemed to stick for long, and Maurice was back in business.
Now, dear sweet, lovable Florence Harding, Warren's wife, has always kind of been at the center of this theory. You mentioned earlier about the child that was eventually discovered from DNA evidence. What do we know about Florence and her personality and their marriage, and how plausible it might be that she had some sort of hand in Harding's undoing?
Florence was a strong-willed woman. I mean, she would have been president if that were an option for women back then. She wanted politics more than he did. And so her only way to be in, the power circles was to be first lady. And so she helped get her husband elected. Some say got him elected. And so she was willing to look the other way for a lot of his dalliances, as long as it was kind of don't ask, don't tell. Don't do it right in front of me and we'll be fine with this. Well, Warren's possibly fatal mistake was he brought one of his mistresses along to Alaska. Warren may have been good looking, may have looked presidential, but he looked intelligent. But I don't think all of those things were necessarily true, because how long he thought he could hide his mistress on a one rail car in remote Alaska from his wife, who's on the same rail car. Don't know. But apparently, at some point during the trip, they had words. They argued, and he was not very happy. Or she was not very happy. And so there's a lot of poisonous plants in Alaska. When I would lead hikes in Denali National Park, I would say to people, unless you are a really, really good botanist, do not eat a blue flower here. There are a number of blue flowers there that could kill you. There's also bluebells, which are delicious. But unless even I, who knew the plants pretty well, was with a trained botanist, I was not going to pick up random flower, and I'd make the botanist eat it first. But there's a lot of stuff. Larkspur, in particular, is pretty deadly in very small doses. So there were rumors that either she sprinkled some in Warren's dinner, or she got Maurice Moreno, who was making the meals. By the way, Maurice was also not a good singer, and he was not a good cook either, apparently. But hey, you're in the middle of Alaska. What are you going to do? So, but he made the meals at the Roadhouse, and he might have slipped something into Warren's dinner, because that night after dinner, Warren started feeling very poorly.
And it's noted that he went downhill very fast. Like, he went from being reasonably healthy for his age and what was going on at the time, and then just a few days later, all of a sudden he's worse for wear. He's already downhill from there. And they've already left Alaska, and it's kind of they're, I believe, back in San Francisco or so.
They were supposed to stay longer in Alaska and see more sights, but he was feeling so badly after dinner that the next morning they decided to pack up and head back. and they took a boat to San Francisco on their way back to DC, but never made it. He died in a hotel in San Francisco.
Wow. And it's kind of the when you look at his rapid decline, his death, and then how she kind of acted afterwards. Florence famously refused an autopsy. They, cited all kinds of reasons why she refused it. And how much would something like that and those kind of times fuel, where the speculation would come from, why we're even talking about it to this day?
And yeah, the that she was so adamant she didn't want an autopsy sent up red flags even at the time. But most historians, in fairness, say he probably had a heart attack. And I've been around people having heart attacks. Bad indigestion and a heart attack are similar symptoms. You can get chest pain and so it could have been a heart attack, but the symptoms aren't exactly the same for a heart attack as what happened to him, nor are they for poisoning. So it's hard to say exactly what he had. It could have been something entirely different that we don't know, but without an autopsy, and at this point, I don't think anybody is curious enough to. He's in a beautiful marble sarcophagus there in Marion. I don't think anybody's going to chisel apart the sarcophagus to try to autopsy him now if the organs are even still intact enough to know. So
What was, I mean, he only served, I mean, he served from 21 to 23 and of course passed away, but what was the general feeling in the country? Was he a well-liked president?
he was still a good looking guy who looked like he should be president, and he was that's why they built this beautiful memorial to him. It was like, oh my god, our tragic president dies young and handsome. And so none of the dirt had surfaced yet. His inner circle certainly knew about all of his mistresses, and the cabinet certainly knew all the graft that they were pocketing here, but but no, the country at large did not really know what was going on, and so it was tragic and it was horrible. And they had a lovely funeral for him, and so a lot of the stuff had not yet bubbled to the surface yet. But shortly after his death, things started to go downhill. Calvin Coolidge succeeds him as president, comes in, and some of his cabinet people are going, "Wait, you were doing what? Wait, what was going on over there? What is this?" And so things started happening, and then women started accusing him of having that they had his baby, Warren's babies and stuff like that. Only one paternity test was done, and it was positive, but there were several other women who said, "Yeah, I got one of his kids too." But all that was after he died.
Yeah. My man was a walking presidential Maury Povich show.
Pretty much, yeah.
And you know what? After hearing how many women he was juggling and kept in it, I would totally buy the heart attack too, man, because that's a lot. It's a lot to keep up.
Yeah, he was stressed.
When we look at Alaska today and the locals and where all this kind of is, McKinley Station and Denali and all of this, do locals believe that he was murdered, or is it kind of just swept under the rug? Do they think about it as an open secret that they talk about? I mean,
Most people poo-pooed it, but in Alaska, you hear that story a lot. And they're almost proud of it. Like, hey, did you know that Warren Harding was poisoned here in Alaska? But it's almost said with a twinkle in the eye and a smile. So I'm not sure how sincerely they believe it, or it just makes, like there's a road on the way to Mount St. Helens in Washington that's all Sasquatch stuff. It's all Bigfoot lives here. It's good business. It's, good for the tourist trade. I don't know how many of them actually think that Bigfoot lives in that valley, but he might. I didn't see him. But so with the Warren Harding thing, yes, people tell that story a lot up there. How sincerely they tell it, I don't know, because as I said, there's kind of a smile and a twinkle there. Warren Harding was poisoned here. His wife did it.
that's a crazy thing to be proud of, but whatever gets the tourist dollars in, correct me if I'm wrong here. You have seen and been on the Harding's presidential rail car
Yes.
that still sits in Alaska. What is it like being or seeing this and knowing the reputation and being a part of this piece of history, seeing it for yourself?
As I said, after Harding took sick, they rushed back to the mainland United States, and he died in San Francisco. But they left behind the presidential rail car, which is a nicely ornate, classy at the time, kind of the Air Force One of the day, because there was not a lot of plane travel back then. But when things started bubbling to the surface, Calvin Coolidge, its Republican successor, didn't want to go near this thing. A lot of bad vibes attached to it. And then his next Republican successor, Herbert Hoover, was like, nah, I can probably get a new rail car. It's okay. You can keep that one. So it is sitting in a park in Fairbanks, Alaska. The rail line that brought it there is gone. So it's just on this little, stretch of track in the middle of this pioneer park in Alaska. And it's kind of creepy because it is like looks forlorn and abandoned and sad out here. And the interior has pretty much been gutted so that they could have these museum type exhibits in there of photos of Warren and the Golden Spike and all of those things. So you don't really get, like, I've been to Ford's Theater and you can kind of get the creepy vibe there. The interior of the rail car is not enough intact that you can go, oh, I know what happened here. I didn't really get that vibe there, but it is kind of interesting to think, like, no important person ever wanted this rail car back, even though it's for the day, it was a very luxurious rail car.
Before we go, you've hinted in our talks leading up to this that there's a strange connection between the Harding scandals and Billy the Kid. You got to fill me in here. It seems like when we look at history, it seems like, these people exist in their own little planes. They're not interconnected any kind of way. So how does this work?
But if you start scratching below the surface, a lot of things are really interconnected, and it's amazing. Like this guy's daughter married this famous person, and that sort of thing. Well, we mentioned Albert B. Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, who sold off the Teapot Dome oil reserves in Wyoming, right? We all know Billy the Kid was shot by his former friend Pat Garrett, right?
Right.
A few years later, Pat Garrett himself gets gunned down. And the guy who is accused of killing him, Jesse Brazil, hires a lawyer named Albert B. Fall to defend him. And even though everybody is pretty sure that Brazil killed Pat Garrett, this slick lawyer, Albert Fall, managed to get him off. And that's how Albert Fall became famous enough to ride that up the political ladder to become eventually Secretary of the Interior. Because it was a national thing that Pat Garrett was murdered in cold blood. Right. It was a national news story. So Albert Fall being willing to defend him and get him acquitted in a one-day trial was like, oh, this guy's pretty slick. And so he went into politics or whatever.
Walter, you are our gas, as they used to say, man. I love chatting with you. Now, before we go, we mentioned the books and all of that you've written. How can people find you online? How can they, pick up your books and follow along with your YouTube journey?
Well, thank you for allowing me a little plug here at the end. I do have, of course, an Amazon authors page, Walter G. Meyer. All my books are under that name. I have my own website, waltergmeyer.com, and I am launching Walt's Wanderings, as you mentioned. There will be a waltzwanderings.com website and a YouTube channel.
Before we go, what does the G in Warren G. Harding stand for?
Gamaliel.
It's from the Bible, right?
Yes, it is. And he lived by biblical principles for sure. Having 100 wives and all of that. Yes.